In 1975, the global reserves were, let's say, 1,000 billion barrels. Today, it's 1,750 billion barrels. And we have consumed about 2 or 3 trillion barrels since then. The oil and gas industry says, yes, you need to look for low emission fuels. Yes, renewable solar and wind, whenever they're available at reasonable prices, let's do them. Let's do them to the fullest. But that will not get us where we need to. Let's use some geothermal. Let's use nuclear. But 80% of the world energy supply today is fossil fuel, and you're not going to be able to switch that off quickly.
Welcome to the Afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on the series, I have Dr. Adnan Shihab-Eldin, who is currently the Senior Visiting Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Adnan has had an illustrious career at the Kuwait Foundation for Advancement of Sciences as the Director General. He also was Acting Secretary General. Acting Secretary General and Director of Research at OPEC, has spent a career in and around the energy industry and in research. It is a huge honor to have you on the series. Welcome to Afikra, Dr. Adnan.
My pleasure, Nike.
I want to ask you just a basic question. A really basic question to start off with, which is, what did you think you would be doing in the world of energy in 2025 if you went back 30 years ago or 35 years ago? What did you think energy would look like if you went back in time?
Well, I mean, if I go back in time 30 or 50 years ago, my career would have been as a scientist doing nuclear science, because that's how I was trained. I didn't have much chance to do nuclear science research beyond 1975. That's almost 50 years ago, because as soon as I came back to Kuwait, having spent 5 years working in the United States for post my PhD, was working in nuclear research at Close Berkeley Laboratory. I got immersed in beyond just doing research, managing research, and was not just managing research. I started managing applied research in Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research, where it included energy. And my initial focus, believe it or not, in 1978, I launched a program at the Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research to look into the potential of solar energy in Kuwait. That was back 1978. And that was supported by the leadership. At that time, the Crown Prince and Prime Minister, the late Sheikh Jabir, gave the go, because he was the chairman of the Board of Trustees. He was supported it. And in fact, we invited him to, we put up quickly a platform, and I'm sure experiment in solar energy within a year or two. And he came and inaugurated it and gave it his blessing. And that led to our biggest solar project in Kuwait in 1984, was the first in the world of 1 megawatt thermal solar concentrating power plant. So you can see that going that way far, I was preoccupied with the energy in general and potential of new ways of producing energy. I was not against fossil at that time. And I still am not against fossil, although I do recognize that fossil fuel, oil in particular, gas, coal in particular, have problems, and basically emitting, when they are used, when they are produced, emitting CO2 that we know is harmful to the environment and produces potentially harmful energy. But at that time, I was focused on being a researcher with a new research institute I am leading. I really looked at that potential. And of course, I kept looking into the potential of nuclear power, hand in hand.
So in 1975, somebody might say, why is Kuwait interested in anything but fossil fuels? I mean, there's so much fossil fuel available. It seemed counterproductive. Was it related to science for the sake of science, or was it related to an environmental movement? What was it related to?
Well, I think the question was asked in Kuwait, why are you pursuing solar energy? I mean, that question became very relevant in 1985 or 86. When I resigned, actually, I resigned in 1986. One of the reasons I resigned is a minister in charge at that time said, why are we doing solar energy? We don't need it. We're an oil country. That's counterproductive. But if I go back, the reason I was doing this in Kuwait is that Kuwait was already one of the largest oil and gas producers in the world. So that was taken for granted. So I was looking for 20, 30, 50 years from now.
Yeah.
What could we do to diversify? And immediately solar energy came, not nuclear, although I was a nuclear scientist, but solar came because solar energy, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to realize that solar fits with Kuwait or Saudi Arabia or the Gulf. The sun,
Yeah.
you're in Dubai, you know what it is. So it was apt that we did look into the potential of solar energy at that time. And it was met with opposition, precisely your question. And in 1986, the minister decided to basically do what Elon Musk is doing, chop off solar energy program, Kuwait Institute for Solar Energy. And it was not until after the 1990s when the new leadership started looking at solar energy again.
Yeah. So let's talk about that 50-year timeline, because part of this whole episode, I mentioned this to you before, is because I'm kind of curious about what does life after oil look like in the GCC. And so I want to talk, part of the reason about going back to 1975 is to begin that long time horizon. So in 1975, you were thinking about 50 years later, which lands you in 2025. Where did you think we would be in 2025? And where are we actually?
I at that time, I thought I was naive about reserves, to be very honest, about oil and gas reserves. I was worried about oil and gas reserves. If you look back in 1975 and you look at the reserves then, almost everybody said, oh, in 50 years, there will be very little left. Okay? So that turned out to be not correct. Because
How wrong were they?
it was quite wrong because
Is it just an arithmetic issue?
no, it's quite wrong. And I learned that during my days in OPEC, where I really dug deep into the question of reserves. It turns out geological reserves are completely different than proven reserves. Geological reserve with continued exploration is always expanding and expanding a lot. It depends how much time and money and you want to invest to find out more oil. There's plenty of oil underground. But proven reserves is what you can produce at that date's technology commercially. So in 1975, the global reserves were, let's say, 1,000 billion barrels. Today, it's 1,750 billion barrels. And we have consumed about 2 or 3 trillion barrels since then. So you can imagine what we are doing is that we're converting a lot of the geological reserves, which is very huge, could be 10 trillions, 15 trillions. We're converting part of it into proven reserves in today's technology at commercial prices. Think of the sort of the shale oil in the United States. It was not part of reserves at that time because it was too expensive to produce it, and the technology that did not exist. Now, today, is part of the proven reserves of the world. So that was one thing that was wrong. So I had thought at that time that 50 years forward, we would need nuclear and solar, and that's all. In reality, today, oil and gas and coal continue to dominate. It's almost still about 80%, maybe 78% of the total. And we have seen renewable led by particularly solar coming into the scene rapidly, but it's still a small component of the total. And you have nuclear under 10%, and then everything else is under 10%, and fossil oil and gas and coal is about 80%, but it's going to go down. The fossil fuels, no doubt, is going to go down, and primarily because we recognize scientifically, is no doubt about it, CO2 emission does change the climate. And that change adds to the natural change, which happens occasionally and all the time sometimes. So 50 years from that time today, one thing has changed. is that the role of fossil fuels dimension and time scale is much longer than what I anticipated at that time.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit, think about projecting forward, and I want to use a term that I've seen you discuss, which is this energy trilemma. Tell me about what is the energy trilemma?
Well, the energy trilemma, simply put, is how do you address the world energy needs in terms affordability, in terms security of supply, okay, and in terms of sustainability, including environmental and climate sustainability. And you have to balance these three. So the best approach is to have policies and technologies that would more or less score highly on these three dimensions.
Yeah.
And very few countries can do that. And if you look at, for example, the World Energy Congress index of this trilemma, you could see the different regions of the world doing better or less. For example, in the Gulf countries, in terms of affordability and access, we do excellent. All right? In terms of security, we do very well. We have plenty of energy. But in terms of sustainability, including climate sustainability, we don't do very well. And that's the reason energy transition in the Gulf is primarily how do you move the needle up in terms of sustainability without compromising on the needle that's already high in terms of security, in terms of affordability. If you look at regions like Europe, they're doing very good in terms of sustainability, but they're doing terrible in terms of security and in terms of affordability, and so on. You can take each region of the world and look where they stand in terms of these three dilemma of the energy. And if I just go back to about the Gulf, you ask me about where do you see the Gulf 50 years from now? I mean, that's the region, the Gulf countries had to look beyond oil and gas, not because oil and gas is running out, not because it's going to disappear as IEA says over 10 years. That's wrong. It's not going to disappear. But in terms of making oil and gas clean and also diversifying into renewable and even nuclear, that's in terms of the energy. And of course, more importantly, diversifying the economy beyond just energy, beyond just oil and gas.
Yeah. Can I ask a really basic question? And this will expose how little I know about the science, but how much cleaner is it today to produce 1 barrel of oil from a place like Kuwait or a place like Saudi Arabia than it was in 1960?
Oh, I would say we are maybe our emission per barrel has dropped by 50%, approximately. I'm just giving you a ballpark figure. Because we have learned about, for example, we stopped what's called flaring gas. Because in the old days, oil comes out almost naturally, with it gas, and the only way to control it is to flare the gas. Now, the gas, when you flare it, CO2. So that has stopped completely, flaring gas. So, and we continue probably in our region because the cost of producing a barrel is one of the lowest in the world. You can afford extra cost to reduce emissions further in the production. I'm talking about emissions in the productions. Okay, scope 1 and scope 2, and the technology of CO2 emission with energy. But that's not talking about emission when you use the oil. That's something else, which is the bulk of the emission. Comes about 80% of the emission of this cycle from extraction, conversion, marketing and selling, and then consuming. 80% of the emission obviously comes when we use it, when you burn it in your car or in the power plant. But per barrel of production in the Gulf countries, they have done a lot, and simply because they were producing it easily, number one. Number two, the cost was low, so you could add technology to combat it.
Yeah.
So
Do you
I
have a
don't know that
sense?
I answered your question.
Yeah. I mean, the reason why I'm asking is because I'm wondering, because usage is a product of is a function of efficiency, right?
Yeah.
So, or I should say it this way, like the dirtiness of fossil fuels, so to speak, the negative consequences of fossil fuels, however big or small they may be, is a product of how much of it you use and how efficient the process is to extract it, right?
Yeah, but both extraction, how efficient you are in extraction, that lowers the emission for extraction. Conversion, how efficient is your conversion in the refineries, okay? And in transportation, you have to be very efficient. But more importantly, how efficient you are in using the product, because that's the bulk. How efficient? Because if I can improve the efficiency of the using the product by 25%, that's much more important than improving the efficiency of extraction and production by 25%, because the CO2 emission is basically with the use primarily. And that use is not in the Gulf countries, that's whoever buying it globally.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter where the oil is coming. So again, the technology, if you look at the energy intensity, CO2 emission intensity per unit of energy, you see that there has been a drop. And also you could see that the relationship between GDP and energy also has dropped. It used to be 1-to-1. You grow 1 unit of GDP, you grow 1 unit of energy. Now it's like 75%. It used to be every 1% growth of GDP produces 1% growth in oil consumption. It's now half or less, sometimes in some countries less than half, perhaps quarter, and so on. So we have come a long way, but still, at the end of the day, there is a limit for efficiency gains. You cannot continue to gain, otherwise you will be violating the laws of thermodynamics, law of physics, as we call them. So I think that's why we are beginning to talk about changing the portfolio of energy mix that we use. So we add renewable, we add nuclear, we add all kinds of low carbon emitting sources, including decarbonized oil and gas. And that's important. Yeah. And that's what the Gulf countries should focus on. And some of them are really focusing on them by really turning their oil and gas product into cleaner fuel. And how do you do that? I mean, there is CO2 you burn, you produce CO2. There are two methods, two simple methods. Either you take your oil and gas, and as you convert it into fuel that has no CO2, and you extract the CO2 in that conversion process and put it underground or mineralize it and store it forever. So that way you produce pure, and that's, for example, simply what's called hydrogen. When you produce hydrogen from, let's say, natural gas, you produce CO2 in the process. You take that CO2, you put it underground for millions of years. So essentially, you have converted your fossil fuel, natural gas, or oil or carbon, into hydrogen, which when it burns, it produces water and nothing else. I mean, hydrogen with oxygen produces water. So that's one way, before you consume. The other way is that when you use the fossil fuel, let's say in a power station, you take the products, the gases that are emitted, and you extract the CO2 from them. And that's called carbon capture. And you store the carbon underground forever. And that's called carbon capture and storage. And now you are also have produced essentially a clean fossil fuels, either prior or after the process. And that's what some of the Gulf countries are doing. And globally, this is really required because you cannot reach zero emission quickly without all fuels participating, including decarbonized fossil fuels, nuclear, renewable, solar, wind, and what have you.
Okay, here's a question for you. Let's say you're speaking to the smartest environmentalists in the world and the smartest advocates for the oil and gas industry. What do you think that they fundamentally agree on in terms of the future? And what do you think they fundamentally disagree on in terms of the future?
I think 99% of both sides would agree that CO2 emissions, if continued at the present level, and if they are not abated and reduced significantly, not necessarily to zero, but significantly, they all agree on that. say 99%. What they disagree on is how to go about doing it. The oil and gas industry says, yes, you need to look for low emission fuels, yes, renewable, solar and wind, whenever they're available at reasonable prices, let's do them to the fullest. But that will not get us where we need to. Let's use some geothermal, let's use nuclear. But 80% of the world energy supply today is fossil fuel, and you're not going to be able to switch that off quickly. And so you're better off finding a way to decarbonize the fossil fuels while at the same time you are harnessing the solar energy and the wind energy. Some of the environmentalists agree with that, but most of them, they will take an extreme view saying that if you decarbonize fossil fuels, you are perpetuating the use of fossil fuel. And they think that by itself is not good. I think basically that's really not what it is, because at the end of the day, it's not the fuel, whether it's good or bad or even. It's what you make out of it and what's out of the product. If you can turn fossil fuel into clean fuels, that's just as good as solar energy. And by the way, if you talk about solar energy or wind or nuclear or whatever, or fossil fuels, and talk about emissions, you don't have to talk about only the direct emission. Because solar energy on direct emissions is very good, excellent, it emits nothing. But you have to look, what was the CO2 emission from producing those panels? Or from producing those cement pillars of the windmills? Okay, and when you do that, you start seeing the picture changing. It's not
or the batteries and
more. I'm not saying that solar on a life cycle basis is less than is more than fossil fuel, but it's appreciably more than what you get when you talk about solar energy is emission free. So I think the difference between the two perspectives, there are two extreme views and there are views in the middle. And the views of the middle don't vary very much between the oil executives and the environmentalists that are reasonably talking science rather than talking ideology. The problem with energy is ideology. I have suffered from ideology not only on the oil and gas, but nuclear. You know, I'm trained as a nuclear engineer. And I know by training that nuclear is one of the better low carbon emission energy sources. But it suffered from ideological belief that nuclear energy is bad on itself. And the reason for that is being Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the conscience of the world.
And Chernobyl.
And Fukushima and Chernobyl and all of that. And yet when you look at the facts, you could come up to a much more reasonable perspective on nuclear energy. And that's why we're beginning to see nuclear energy making a comeback for the third time.
When you speak to, COP28 was a very big deal in the region.
In Dubai, yeah.
In Dubai. In what ways do you think COP28 failed, and in what ways do you think it succeeded?
I think it succeeded in several ways that were very important. For the first time, there was a consensus in writing that we need all kinds of low carbon fuels, including explicitly nuclear, including explicitly decarbonized fossil fuel. I think where it failed to get a headway, and this has been with us since 1992, with the UN, when they signed the UN Framework on Climate Change Convention, is there been a failure to get to grips on who is responsible to address this problem in proportional way.
Explain what that means. What does that mean?
I say that. But let's look at today's situation. We are emitting about 40 gigaton of CO2 approximately today in the atmosphere from the energy. And that's responsible, if you look at 150 years, integrate all of what we have emitted and what has been absorbed by the oceans and by the air, we are left with about 2,500 gigaton of CO2 in the atmosphere since the pre-industrial extra CO2. Okay? And that's the climate change phenomenon. And that already has led to 1.3, 1.4 Celsius degrees increased in the average global temperature. Already. And Paris Agreement was talking about an aspiration of limiting that increase to 1.5. We're already almost at 1.5. From what? Not from the future emissions. The future emissions will get us beyond that. But the 2,500 gigatons that's in the atmosphere already, all right? That's really the bulk of the problem. Now, there are two ways of solving any environmental problem. You know that at the village level, at the city level, whenever you have a spillage or something, you have two ways to deal with it. First, you stop the pollution. You stop dumping garbage in the street. You stop dumping oil and sewage in the ocean or on the river, right? So you have to do that. But that by itself does not clean the environment. You need to find a way to clean the environment, take at least some of it back, not everything, because nature can take off some of that, but not by itself. And it takes a long time scale for nature to take the CO2, the 2,500 gigaton in the atmosphere, to take them, to absorb them by the ocean, will take almost thousands of years. So there is a responsibility on the part of those who put that CO2 in that. Everybody knows that. But that problem is being put in the back. Those who are responsible say, okay, let's put that in the back. Let's focus on the future. And so the negotiation has been very tense on this. There's two ways of addressing this. Either say, okay, I'm not going to do anything about that, but I'm going to stop today emitting. Everybody has to stop today emitting. And then the developing countries say, wait a second, we haven't even emitted to ask us to stop. You have benefited for the last 50 or 100 years from emitting cheap oil and gas. That's why the United States is a global economy, a major global economy. That's why China made it so quickly over the last 30 years by using coal and oil and emitting. And you are asking Africa and India and Middle East and Latin America, say, stop immediately for the sake of humanity. Wait a second. If you want us to do that, we're willing to do that. But you have to pay for it, not us. So what did the COPs before COP in Dubai agree on? They all agreed after Paris negotiation that agrees that the industrial countries will pay $100 billion per year for the developing countries and for the most poorly developed. And that never materialized.
Can I ask you for...
COP29 made that $300 billion, but it's not materializing. So you cannot have it both ways. You cannot have your cake and eat it too. I advocate, I in my lectures, I say we are on a Noah's Ark of environmental salvation. We are on a Noah's Ark going to a target of zero emission, but we are boarding that unequally. People who emitted 2,000 gigaton are being asked to board this ark free of charge, and they shouldn't be on board free of charge. That's the failure of COP28, COP29. They haven't been able to focus on this problem and solve it once forever.
When you say pay 300 trillion or 300 billion, what did you say? Billion. Okay, so when you say pay 300 billion
to the developing country.
Okay, so is that basically in credit, or what is the actual transaction? I mean, what is the proposed transaction supposed to be?
It has never been defined. It was just the principle. That's a problem. Is that whether it's 100 or 300. The developing countries, what they want is that they want the developing countries to finance the clean energy transition.
Yeah.
Because stopping using oil and gas, that's what some of them advocate, is at a cost. It's not just cost of putting solar energy or wind. You are basically slowing down an industrial revolution, changing infrastructure, changing behavior, and losing opportunities. So you have the developing countries, especially the very poor developing countries, are asking industrialized countries that put that CO2 in the atmosphere, you have to pay something to help us in this process.
So
Now,
let me,
all what has been agreed upon is the amount approximately, but nothing else. And
yeah,
that's the
and it's not
reason
even agreed upon. It's just
it's
a,
just a principle, it's a target. And the
so
payment has been nothing. I have
let me
maybe
try
some 10,
to,
20 billion a year has gone to a solar project here, a wind project there. And so that's really the failure.
let me try to explain this back to you and see if I understand it. Okay. Basically, the developed countries, the US and Western Europe
And
and
Japan,
China, and
and
Japan
now
and China,
and China in the last 30 years.
basically, we're all in a race. All of these nations are in a race. And they have been driving a car in the race. And everyone has been on bicycles and walking. And basically, they're saying we all agree that cars are bad in this hypothetical. We all agree that the cars are not a good thing. We should all stop driving cars. And all the other countries, Nigeria, Pakistan, India, Malaysia, Indonesia, Brazil, Egypt, right? All of these countries are saying, wait, we didn't even buy our car. We're about to buy the car. We're about to buy the car to catch up with you guys. And now you're telling me we can't buy a car. Okay, if you're not going to let us buy a car, you have to buy us a bunch of bikes. You have to buy us bikes so that we can try to catch up with you.
That's half of the picture. Yeah, you're right. I mean, you put it rightly, but as I say, that will not be sufficient. What they need to do, those industrial countries, because that on a time scale that we're talking about, they have to take some of that CO2 in the atmosphere out. And there are technologies that have
So
been
tell us
developed.
about the other half. Tell us about how
Yeah, I mean,
they're supposed to fix
there are
it.
technologies today in the market to take CO2 from the atmosphere. It's called direct air capture. You take CO2, you have blowers that suck the air like a windmill, but instead of rotating like this, the windmill will suck the air and separate CO2 from the other components of the air, which is nitrogen and oxygen. And that small quantity, which is, 300 parts per million CO2, you basically put it underground or turn it into minerals and store. And we are basically, that process is imitating nature. Nature is doing that all the time.
Yeah.
It's called weathering. And with the ocean, with the water and things, you turn CO2 into solids, carbonate, and they deposit in the bottom of the ocean. So direct air capture is a process to accelerate that. Because we spent quickly in 100 years, we burnt so much fossil fuels, and now we realize there is a penalty for that. Now we have to clean it up. So direct air capture technology existed commercially for a different purpose. You know, when you drink Coca-Cola or any beverage with the fizzy stuff, some of it is the CO2 that you have to put. If you don't have easy access to CO2, if you are a bottling company, if you don't have access to cheap CO2 from a refinery or natural, what do? You buy it from a company. There are a few of these companies, Switzerland and Canada, that does nothing but capture the CO2 from the atmosphere and sell it to the bottling company. So basically, technology is in place commercially for a different purpose. But you have to scale it from 1 million ton per year, which we are not even at that. We are at 100,000, to gigatons, maybe 10 gigatons, because we're emitting 40 gigatons. So we need to scale direct air capture to about a gigaton, 2 gigatons, 3 gigatons.
1 million to a gigaton is 1,000x.
1,000.
So basically, we need to go 10,000x our current capacity.
10,000 from the current capacity.
So
we're doing that, but we need to scale it up, and we have to scale. Who's going to pay for that? Right now it costs approximately $1,700 to $1,000 per ton to extract it from that. We need to bring that down to below 100. Below 100. So I'd say about a factor of 5, a factor of 10, factor of 5. And then it becomes reasonable. The U.S., under the Biden administration, had a very ambitious plan aiming to reach 1 million ton and then scaling up. to 10 million and then scaling up to 100 million over a 10 or 15-year period. But I think with the Trump administration, that program is likely to be killed, unfortunately. I'd say,
Yeah.
unfortunately, it's likely to be killed.
So my question is this. If this solution that you're describing is viable, and somehow we figure out the technology to be able to scale it 10,000x and figure out the affordability so that to foot that bill is possible, the final question is, where does the political will come from? So in the Arab world, are the states, at least let's say the states in the oil producing states, are they net winners or net losers in the situation where that bill does not get paid?
They're net losers.
So why don't they use leverage to force this bill to get paid? Why do you think?
They're doing that, but they haven't successful. I mean, they're doing it on two levels. One of them is the negotiations and the costs and what have you. And I think COP28 succeeded in some respect to move away from this call, let's stop using oil, let's stop using coal. And they succeed in saying, let's stop using unabated oil, unabated coal. What is unabated? It means it has not been decarbonized. So instead of moving oil and gas out, phasing it out, phasing unabated oil and gas. That has been the focus of the oil and gas producing country. And that's very legitimate. Because at the end of the day, it's the emission that you are worried about, not the oil and gas itself. The second is some of the oil gas country, in particular Saudi Arabia, entered into the development and demonstration and possibly deployment of these technologies, not because they are responsible, but because when they participate in developing these technologies and making them more affordable, those countries that put the CO2 cannot say it's too expensive, because it has been the cost has been brought down by the participation of the oil and gas producing countries in commercializing these decarbonization technologies. So in my view, participating in decarbonizing the oil and gas technologies is a win-win situation for the oil and gas producing countries. And not participating in them is a lose-lose proposition.
Yeah. It's interesting because I guess part of the big problem with what you just described as a solution is that it's not clear what the business model is. If there was a business model and it was clear to find a natural buyer who can use the features the features of market dynamics to say, okay, I'm going to pay for this because I'm going to be the one that benefits tremendously. But when you remove carbon from the air, everybody benefits.
Well, yeah, and we are not responsible for removing the 2,000 gigaton or even 10% of it. But it's good for us that technology becomes commercial.
Okay.
And so if we can help commercializing that technology, we're not going to be the ones who decarbonize 250 out of the 2,000.
Yeah.
We will probably decarbonize or take away from 1 or 2 gigatons. And let's remember, there are countries like Japan that signed agreement with Saudi Arabia to import decarbonized ammonia. Okay, so but again, these are not commercial. Both sides looking into the future, and they think there is a win for them. So you really have to look for that partnership, where what you think is a win for you in the future, and you're working on it from today, with someone else who thinks that it's a win for them in the future, and they're working on it from now. Well, that's the reason you see this bilateral agreements with Japan, Korea, sometimes with Western Europe on hydrogen. Although Western Europe is hung up on green hydrogen only, they have not really, at least Germany, which is the main users of energy, really hydrogen can be produced, decarbonized hydrogen, either green from solar energy, which is fine, but it's very costly right now, 3 times as much as it costs producing hydrogen in the refinery, or you can produce with natural gas, as I said, and you take the CO2 and you store it away, and that's less expensive. So we need to find partners on a bilateral basis, on a regional basis, and in the conferences of the parties to get this agreement. There is no business model today what will succeed in the future. Anybody who thinks about that is a dreamer. I don't know. If I knew about one, I would not be talking to you. I'll be making billions. So nobody knows about a business model that will
Yeah.
be successful in the future. You just guess your best guess based on knowledge of science and technology of today, and you make some exploration in it, investment in it. Imagine if in Kuwait we pursued solar energy in the 80s as we were doing it. We would be the leading solar energy country in the Gulf and in the world, perhaps. And by the way, that 1 megawatt plant that I described to you, it was paid for by West Germany at that time, by the ministry, not by Kuwait, because there was a mutual interest. The Germans wanted to test their technology in the desert, and we were looking, can we make benefit from solar energy? There's plenty of it here in our country, in addition to oil. So there was that man.
What are the downsides of solar energy? I mean, you need tons of space. You need tons of batteries to store all this stuff. I mean, what are the downsides?
You put, the 2 or 3 things, solar in particular, and wind. First, they are intermittent. They're not constant. They fluctuate. And in solar, it's even worse. There's no solar energy at night.
Yeah.
So it's not only intermittent because of cloud and dust and what have you, but there are periods between 8 hours to 16 hours in our part of the world. In some parts of the world, 6 months. I just came back from Antarctica, and then winter, Antarctica has no solar energy over now.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. This dilution is the second thing. Dilution means it's low intensity per square meter. Okay? Yeah. So you need a huge square kilometer to produce a gigawatt, while you can have a 100 square meter or maybe one square kilometer to produce a gigawatt from a power station, normal power station.
Yeah.
So you talk about a factor of 1,000 in terms of space requirement. Okay? So you have the dilution, which requires a lot of space. Intermittency is the killer, really, because you need. How do you use energy when you want to use it? You turn your air conditioner, not when the sun is shining. So the problem with solar energy is that it's the cheapest today. Today it's the cheapest by far, but only when the sun is shining it's the cheapest. When the sun is not shining, solar energy power plant is the most expensive because there is no sun. So what do? You go to your battery, or you have a backup sitting idle, you paid for it, and you run it on natural gas. So you pay double. Germany, for example, their total capacity, power capacity, electricity, is about 300 gigawatt. Their peak demand is under 100. Peak demand is under 100. The bulk, 200 gigawatt, is renewable, but they have a 100 gigawatt approximately. I'm giving you standby gas and coal and nuclear from neighboring country. So that's the reason the most country that advocates renewable and pushing for renewable is the country where it has the highest cost of electricity. Yeah. How do you solve this dilemma? The secret is that you have to compensate for the dilution. You have to compensate for the unavailability by batteries or alternatives. And the more penetration, when solar is contributing 5%, it's the most advantageous. When solar becomes contributing 20%, you pay a penalty for it. And when it's 30%, you reach almost like a barrier. 40% explodes, exponential expensive. It's not the cost of producing solar electricity. It's the cost of the system as a whole. 24 hours, 365 days. That becomes the problem.
Okay, I've 4 more questions before we wrap up that I really want to get through. I want to talk about global warming. Obviously, this is not directly your specialty, but I want to talk a little bit about what smart policymakers are thinking about, and the scientific community is thinking about when it comes to global warming in the Arab world? What countries are being affected most intensely, and who is most concerned in the Arab world about the effects of global warming? Or climate change, I should say.
Well, I think as a region, we are sitting in a region where, based on this models, as far as I know, the average temperature increase will be higher in our region than other parts of the world. When you combine that with the bulk of the region as being desert and dry, you can think that the air conditioning requirements is going to explode, and drought will increase, and agriculture will be affected. And here, when you look at these different sectors, you will have different countries. Agriculture impact will be most severe, felt in Egypt, Sudan, and these, countries. In terms of comfort and air conditioning load will be the Gulf countries, but also other countries that normally did not require. And I think in Lebanon, Lebanon and Syria is becoming impossible to live with no air conditioning these days. I recall when I was young, we go in the summer into Lebanon and Syria and Damascus and Beirut, we never use air conditioning. It is so pleasant to, but now you cannot do it. And so I think climate change affects our region in particular the most, and in different parts of our region in a different sectors though. In the agriculture sector, building sector, housing, and so on. Now, what are we doing about it? I think we have recognized, or policymakers have recognized after some period of denial, that climate change is based on rigorous science. And we know, as a physicist, I know is that if you put more CO2 in the atmosphere, you're going to increase the surface temperature of the Earth. There's no way about it. Just simple model, back of an envelope calculation will tell you that. So I think there is a recognition for that. I think that's why you're beginning to see acceptance of being part of the global push for global solutions to reduce CO2 emission, and to what we are doing about it. We do some, but we want those who were responsible to take more responsibility. But we cannot rely on the others only. So we have to do a lot on ourselves, and that's manifested by increasing renewable up to a point. I would say renewable in the Arab countries should continue to expand, especially solar, up to about 20, 30%, maybe 40%, but no more at this point based on current technology. We have to continue to use alternatives like nuclear or decarbonize our fossil fuels in the power plants, make them hydrogen, store the CO2. That's the reason we have to take leadership in carbon capture for environmental reasons, not because we want others to access this technology cheaper. It's in our advantage to master carbon capture. I would just say one more thing about policy. They have to realize that if you don't work together, working alone will not get you very far.
If you were going to a conference, and a conference in the Arab world, and the keynote speech was entitled "A Smart Post-Oil Arab Economy," would you say to yourself, this is a ridiculous idea? There is never going to be a post-oil economy in the oil and gas states of the Arab world.
Well, I think you're putting it in a black and white. If you're saying post-oil, that means zero oil, I would say ridiculous. There will not be that. But I would say post dominance of oil, that is a proposition that we should embrace. We should embrace post-dominance of oil in our economy. We should continue to produce oil, decarbonize the oil or gas, sell it as decarbonized or whatever. But we should not keep our economies hostage to the revenues of oil. And we have to recognize the world one day will reduce its consumption of oil. It's not going to be in the next 10 years. Maybe we will start seeing some peaking in 15, 20 years. I don't know. Nobody knows exactly. Peak oil, I was struggling with peak oil from a supply side when I was in OPEC. And I was defending that we could supply the world with oil no matter what. And now the peak oil is about demand. There is no demand for oil. And I'm of the same view. I think it's premature to say demand for oil is peaking. Even IEA yesterday or a couple of days ago, they changed their mind. They were saying the peak oil will be in the next couple of years. And now, because of Trump and others, they've changed it. So I think the fact that oil will have to recognize it's not the only industrial fuel. There are natural gas, which is less emitting. There's nuclear coming. Solar and wind are on the rise. And we, as a main oil-producing countries, we cannot continue to rely only on oil. We have to rely on oil decarbonized, but we have to rely on other energy sources. And our economy should move away from oil and energy into other sectors. So I would be happy to give a keynote about post-oil dominant world, but not post-oil, because I don't know when oil will stop being important. 100 years from now, 50 years from now, 30 years from now. If you know, please tell me.
Is the concept of peak oil from the demand side, is that idea essentially saying that this is, there will never be a time when oil is in such demand, and from now on, it's all downhill from here?
That's basically what the IEA has advocated for the last few years. And that some of the environmentalists have advocated, and they focused on oil and not so much on coal, which is even worse. So it has some political connotation.
Sure.
As I said earlier, nobody disputes the fact that oil, as well as natural gas and coal, emit carbon dioxide, and it's harmful carbon dioxide to the environment. But the solution is not to stop using oils immediately. The solution is to look for alternative ways of decarbonizing oil itself by taking the CO2 out of it in the production and in the use, and by using renewable, by using nuclear, by using geothermal. Geothermal now is coming back and it's becoming very important. There was a few reports came out this year about the potential of geothermal. And in our region, geothermal, especially in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, Western Saudi Arabia, Yemen, in the Atlas Mountains, and many regions of our, in Iraq, in Eastern Iraq. Geothermal is a very important resource to look at, which is low carbon and sustainable. So, as I said earlier, when I was at OPEC, the worry was about peak supply. People saying, oh, there's not enough oil reserves. And one guy has made millions by writing a book about peak oil. The title of his book was Peak Oil. And we used to tell him, no, there's plenty of geological reserve. We just have to explore. And when we understood, but now, because of the environmental, they focused on it, and politically, because oil is in our region, more gone, they say, move away from oil. And because oil is the jewel, Daniel Yergin read the famous book, The Prize, which meant the oil prize.
Yeah.
So it is important to recognize that in the same way that peak supply was not real, peak demand is not real, at least in the time scale we're talking about. 20, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years.
Yeah. Before I let you go, I have to ask you, at what point in your career did you feel like nuclear energy had the best chance of becoming a clear, viable kind of dominant energy source? And at what point did you fear that this will never work?
Well, I think nuclear energy went through cycles, and my views on it were influenced by the cycle. Basically, fundamentally, as a nuclear scientist and nuclear engineer, I always held the view that if we develop nuclear properly and manage to find a way to harness it economically and regulate it safely, properly, and train our people, it's one of those best solutions, because per gram of fuel, it produces 1 million times per gram of oil or gas in terms of energy. You probably don't know that when in 1976, Kuwait issued, 1978, Kuwait issued a RFP for a 50 megawatt reactor, commercial reactor. And of course, we were hurt by 3 Mile Island accident, 1917. So we shelved that program. We revived the program in the 80s because whenever the price of oil goes up, it's better for you to produce more oil and sell it and take the money and build a nuclear power plant. That's simple economics. So in the middle 80s, we tried again, and then was Chernobyl. And Chernobyl killed nuclear, not just in our region, all over the world. And then Fukushima. In Fukushima, before Fukushima, we followed the example of the Emirate. We set up a nuclear commission. We set up plans. We copied what they were doing. We were about to issue RFP, and Fukushima happened.
Do you remember where you were when you found out about Chernobyl?
I was in Kuwait University, and we were the first country in Kuwait University to pick up the radioisotope signature of the cloud. We had a laboratory on top of the university, physics department, and I had a colleague, and he came to me quickly and said, look, we saw the signature of the cloud coming. So I was in Kuwait. But a few months after that, I ended up part of an international team visiting Chernobyl.
You're kidding me.
In 1987, I went to Chernobyl. I didn't go inside, but I went into the exclusive zone with a team of international scientists to verify how bad it is. And I was convinced it's manageable. If I could go to the exclusion zone within a few months after the accident, it's manageable. And the same thing so my view is, the more I learned about these accidents, Chernobyl in particular, Fukushima, the more I believe that nuclear has a future, because we are learning to move away from ideology and fear mongering about the China syndrome and all of this science fiction into reality. Yes, nuclear is more expensive because it's more complex technology. In nuclear, you need to set up regulation, safety regulation. But you need also to set up an international safety regulation that's enforceable. Right now, we don't have that, and that's one of the problems. You know, when there's an accident in Chernobyl or Fukushima, the radioactive material that comes out does not stop at the border asking for a visa. It just moves on. And so you have to regulate it internationally. The International Atomic Energy Agency, where I worked for a few years, provide advice on regulation, but it does not enforce safety. It enforces proliferation of nuclear weapons, like in the case of Iraq and Iran, but it does not enforce safety. And that's one of the weaknesses of the current system. So I'm a believer. I think the more I learned about accident, the more I learned that there is a future for nuclear power. And now with the climate, that's become even incumbent upon us to move into, especially the small modular reactors that are more safe and more flexible to be used for different, and you don't have initial capital cost that is very high. You can, instead of 1,000 megawatt one reactor, you can break it into 1,000 megawatt reactor and build them incrementally. And you don't expose yourself to the risks, losses, and delays of 1,000 megawatt.
Dr. Adnan, thank you so much. I really appreciate you doing this. It was very informative. I learned a lot, so thanks so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. I hope I did not put too much technicality in our discussion, but I'm very grateful to you and to your audience.
Thank you so much.